first thing to say is just thank you very much for coming here, trekking out. It's cold out there. So look, let's talk about leadership. Let's get to what we're here for. And I thought I'd begin with a little bit of this.
It got to a point where I really didn't even want to look too much during the speech over to that side, because honestly, it was bad energy. No, it was bad energy. You're up there, you've got half the room going totally crazy, wild. They loved everything. They want to do something great for our country. And you have the other side, even on positive news, really positive news like that, they were like death and un-American. Un-American. Somebody said treasonous. I mean, yeah, I guess why not?
The conclusion we can draw from that if you don't cheer and applaud at me today, that there's something wrong with you rather than with me. The amazing thing with that video was what we didn't include in it. The bits we didn't include and we cut out. We had an earlier version and we just thought, can we show that? Should we show that? And we cut it out. Now look, we can pick on Trump because he's an easy target. And there's no doubt that leadership, 2017 was not a great year for leadership. I mean, we picked on Trump. We could have picked on quite a few others. But I picked on Trump in particular because of some research that came out about a month ago. And once a year, something comes out called the Edelman Trust Survey. And what it does is it has a look at trust in institutions, in business, in media, in NGOs, in government. And it tracks it year on year. And the amazing thing is what has happened to trust levels in American institutions in this first year of Trump's reign, shall we call it. And it goes a bit like that. Trust in institutions has dropped in the US in the last 12 months twice as much as anywhere else in the world. Even, I mean, President Zuma's been doing his best to undermine trust out in South Africa, but, that's nothing. Absolutely nothing compared to what's happened in the US. And the reason why I wanted to pick on this is it shows what leadership can do. It shows that beyond the immediate impact that leaders have on the actions people take, on results, on things that happen, it can have a subtler, deeper impact on culture, on the way that people think, on the way that people behave. And if this is true for politics, it's true for businesses too. We know that leaders have an immediate, direct impact on results. But leaders also have an indirect impact. They have an impact on the culture within a business, how debates are done, how decisions are made, attitudes towards risks, the sense of team, collaboration, these sorts of things, the culture of a business. Leaders operate on both this direct and indirect level. And just as in the political sphere, when things go wrong, it can have a deeper underlying impact on the culture, so it happens within business too. Now, a leader's impact on these different levels is perhaps most shown by some of the really high-profile cases we've seen out there of stars. And I'm working with a business with a leader who has turned around the business commercially, no doubt about it. And everyone refers to them as a genius. They say the CEO is an absolute genius, what he's done with that business. But day in, day out, they live in fear. Day in, day out, there is a culture of fear within that business. And it's kind of ironic. They're investing lots in development and people, and they speak this language of development, but underneath it, people are afraid to raise their voices. People are afraid of being exited at the slightest thing. And so you get this discrepancy between the direct impact of the leader, this visible thing which everyone sees, that everyone praises them for, and then this hidden, indirect impact on the culture of the business. Now, this kind of discrepancy isn't anything new. I mean, Barbara Kellerman wrote a great book back in 2004 called Bad Leadership, which called this out. So there's growing awareness of it. And over the last 5-10 years, there's been a far greater emphasis on the dark side of leadership. Some of these, there's lots more surveys out now, and a lot more development is done, not just on trying to develop the great things in leaders, but overdone strengths and trying to call out where leaders' potential derailers may be. So there's far greater emphasis on this. But I think the reason why this is really growing is just because of the times we live in. We live in undoubtedly a period of great uncertainty for many businesses. And for many of our clients, tough times too, tough trading conditions. And that makes leadership difficult. It has two impacts for leaders. First of all, it just makes the task of leadership harder. Just delivering results gets harder in tough and uncertain times. But the other thing is, the other relevance for us, the other relevance for leadership, is that tough and uncertain times change how leaders behave. And often not in a good way. They can bring out the best in people, no doubt about it. But it can also have a negative impact. And today, this morning, in the next hour, what we're going to try and do is have a look at that deeper cultural level. We're going to try and dig beneath some of the immediate results, some of the immediate impact that leaders have, and have a look at some of those hidden things that go on beneath the surface. Okay? And the reason we're going to do that, the reason why we think it's important to do that, is because when things go wrong, it is less visible. It is harder to change this cultural impact, and it's more pervasive. In fact, we tend to refer to these things as cultural toxins because they can poison a business's ability to function effectively. Both short-term, its ability to respond to those tough and uncertain times, but also it can create this kind of cultural scars within a business. I'm sure, we've all seen it. Okay, so we're going to do three things. We're going to talk about how do you know if this is happening within your business? 8 signs and symptoms. And this is from our work, going out to businesses, talking, seeing what's happening in them, seeing what's happening on a cultural level. So we're going to go over 8 signs and symptoms. Then we're going to talk very quickly about, okay, so how do you identify these? How do you measure these? How can you call it out when it's happening? And then we're going to just have a look very quickly at what can you do about it? How can you manage it? How can you counter these cultural toxins? And in particular, how can you use selection and development processes to stop this kind of negative impact happening? Sound okay? Brilliant. Now, in these little pockets in front of you, we've got some lovely little voting things. And this is the point where I go through a period of mild terror. Because, it may work, it may not work. We're about to find out. What I want you to do, first of all, is just to have a think about how the last couple of years have changed behavior in your firm. I just want you to have a think about that. And I want you to think about it in 2 ways. First of all, if you think about how leaders' behavior has changed, do you think that's been good for results? Or do you think the way in which leaders' behavior has changed and the way in which leaders have responded to these times has actually been bad for results? And then I want you to think about, has it been good for culture? Has it improved the culture of the business, the way that your leaders have responded to these times? Or do you think actually it's been bad for it? Okay? And once you thought about that, I need you to vote. If you think it's increased results, if you think the way that leaders have responded to tough and uncertain times has increased results and improved the culture in your business over the last couple of years, press A or 1. If you think it's increased results but damaged the culture, press B or 2. If you think it's somehow decreased results but improved culture, I'll be really interested if there's anyone out there who presses that, press 3 or C. And if you think it's just bad news all round, press 4 or D. Vote away. And you are voting. All right, let's see what you said. Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. So about a third of you, just under a third of you, think that it's increased results and improved the business culture. You think the way that leaders have responded has been, generally in your business, has been a good thing. But there's about 2/3 of you who are saying it hasn't been great for the business culture. You've got 43% there are saying, hey, it's been great for business results, but actually, you know what? We think there's been a bit of a problem in the culturally. And about 23% of you just think it's bad news all round. Okay, so about 2/3 of you are sitting there and saying, in our business, it hasn't been great for the culture the last two years. I've got to say, in terms of what we speaking to people out there, that tends to be what we find. We kind of closer to 75% who kind of think it's more culturally damaging, but so you're a more optimistic bunch, or more positive bunch than the rest. Okay, all right. With that as our baseline then, let's have a think about some of those cultural toxins. Let's have a look at, very briefly, 8 signs and symptoms. And afterwards I'm going to ask you which ones of these you actually recognize. And I'm going to skim through these fairly quickly because a lot of them should be fairly recognizable. And remember, what we're talking about is down here. Okay, when a leader's behavior, regardless of whether it's improved results or made them worse, when it's had a negative impact on a business's culture. Okay, so the first of these, the first sign and symptom that something is going wrong on a cultural level is very as simple as this, is stress. Now, stress is both a cause of unfortunate behavior and a symptom of it. It's just very simple. All the research shows stress levels are higher in tough and uncertain times. And it can have a positive impact, but few people, I would suggest, are made better by continually high levels of stress. It doesn't tend to bring out the best in people. So if you're seeing people more stressed, there's your first sign and symptom. The second one is gossip and political behavior. There's lots of research showing that with higher uncertainty and lower business optimism, what you get is higher levels of gossip and political behaviors. And the reason that becomes damaging, whatever you think of gossip and political behaviors, the reason it's damaging is it tends to undermine trust and collaboration, which is not good for how your business functions on a day-to-day basis. Third thing, decreased collaboration, siloization. People get their head down, they're focused on just their area, and why not? There's extra pressure on you. You've got to deliver results. You look after yourself, you and your own first. And if you can help out other people, fine, but it's you and your own first. People are less willing to do anything that places pressure on their resources, less willing to extend themselves. So you tend to get decreased collaboration. This one's one of my favorite ones, descent into detail. We see it in leaders a lot. It's particularly hidden. But leaders tend to get dragged down because there's extra focus on just operational delivery. And so they tend not to do the more strategic stuff. They tend to get drawn down into just making sure shit happens, making sure things get done. And that gives you a double whammy. First, well, triple whammy. First of all, leaders aren't doing the strategic stuff that they're supposed to. Second things, it means that everyone shuffles down a bit. Because the leaders are stepping down, their direct reports end up shuffling down a bit. So they're actually removing development opportunities for their direct reports because their direct reports are not functioning at a higher level as they should do because the leader's doing it for them. So this descent into detail, delegation becomes derailed, everyone steps down a level, strategic thinking forgotten, it's all just let's get stuff done. Now, those are some of the more obvious ones. Let's have a look at some of the more hidden ones. One of the more hidden ones up there is something called groupthink. Are you familiar with the phenomenon of groupthink? I think probably most of you are. And there's the definition of it, strictly speaking, is when striving for unanimity overrides realistic appraisal of alternatives. In other words, we just want to agree and let's just get the debate over with and get on with stuff. And what you see is that people overestimate their capabilities, closed-mindedness to alternatives, pressure for uniformity, and the results of that is, well, what the researchers call low data search. In other words, you're not considering all the opinions. Suppressed debate, biased assessment of risk, poor contingency planning. This isn't good stuff. Possibly the most famous example of it over the last decade or so came from UBS. Now, UBS, heads up to them, hands up, they were great. They are the only only one of the major banks that struggled during the banking crisis of 2008 to actually make public a report into what went on internally. And one of the things, I mean, it's quite interesting reading if you haven't read it before, but one of the things that stands out very clearly is that groupthink most definitely happened. At their most senior levels, yes, they didn't understand some of the products that were being sold, but also there wasn't real debate. There was a suppression of debate. And there was this this focus and pressure for uniformity and unanimity. It makes really interesting reading. Now, the reason why groupthink is particularly interesting is that typically we tend to blame leaders. You know, if things go wrong, everything is their fault, isn't it? The buck stops somewhere. The fascinating thing with groupthink is you lot here, right? You look like a nice bunch. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that you are the most capable people out there. They don't come any better than you. I'd put up a mirror here, but it's just that they don't come any better than you. But the fascinating thing is that if I put you in a room, no matter how good you are, no matter how great you are, chances are you're going to start engaging in groupthink. You put a bunch of people together for long enough, put them under sufficient pressure, and groupthink is going to emerge, regardless of their individual capability. It's entirely natural to suppress information flow, focus discussions on things already agreed, have more extreme attitudes, more extreme judgments, less flexible and adapting approach to changing circumstances, and, this is my favorite bit, have greater confidence in your decisions. All of that and greater confidence. And that is entirely natural. It just happens if you put people in a room long enough. In fact, it's a bit weird when it doesn't happen. So, there's groupthink. Changes in pace. In particular, around decision making. And this you often see as, you don't often look at it, you don't tend to see it as kind of like a cultural toxin, but it's there, it happens. The research shows that when you place people under pressure or put them in situations of greater uncertainty, one of the first things that changes is their pace of decision making. And they tend to flip one of two ways. They either become quicker and more rapid, maybe it's anxiety pushing them, maybe it's pressure, or they become more risk averse and slower, and they tend to flip one of those two ways. Now, sometimes that's appropriate, but it increases the chances of mistakes. Either way, it increases the chances of mistakes. So we often don't see this, we often don't recognize it out there as a symptom, as a negative thing, but it's there and it's happening. And the final thing I want to put up there is short-termism. Is there anyone here who hasn't experienced what they would call short-termism in decision-making? Do I need to say anything else? Okay, let's move on. Short-termism then. It happens. So look, there are, despite me saying there would be 8 at the beginning, including the hidden one, so hidden you can't actually see it. And I can't mention it.
It's so toxic.
It's so toxic, thank you. I hadn't thought of that one, yeah. It's so toxic I can't mention it. But like the others, it's spread by tough times and uncertainty. It's not experienced by all, but most people are touched by at least some of these. And they poison a firm's ability to respond effectively to commercial changes. And they are out there. And just to double check that, what I want to do now is to ask you to vote. You can vote for more than one, but I want you to press the buttons for if you have seen any of these in your business. So, stress, 1, gossip and politics, 2, less collaboration, 3, descent into detail, 4, groupthink, 5. And here's the 2 decision makings. I broke them out into 2. That's why we got 8. Increased pace of decision making, risk aversion, or short-termism. Press as many buttons as you like, and let's see what comes up. A few more of you left to vote. This is where we get a long line of zeros at the bottom, and you all say, I haven't seen any of those ever. Okay, We call it quits there? There's 2 of you who haven't voted this time? Let's move on. Whoa. Okay, so most popular out there is descent into detail. Fascinating. Okay. Stress is up there, you'd expect that. We've got gossip and politics up there, short-termism up there. The 2 which are probably less seen and less visible are the groupthink and the people rushing, the increased pace of risk aversion. So all of this around decision-making, really interesting, less seen by you. I find that quite interesting because I would have thought that was one of the things most of the research shows that that's possibly actually where most of the action's occurring, where an awful lot of the impact of tough times and uncertainty is happening on decision making. And that's what it's changing you. Go on.
Do you think we kid ourselves?
Yeah. But I'm too polite to say so.
If there's less collaboration, how can it be also groupthink?
Because so groupthink tends to be what happens within individual teams, within a room, in terms of how decisions are making. Collaboration tends to be more between teams, what's going on, are 2 functions cooperating together as much as they should, are 2 areas of the business, working to help each other out as proactively as they should, or are they just looking after their own resources, looking out for their own objectives and not worrying about anything else. Okay. All right, so that's interesting, just that we didn't focus on those quite as much. Is there anyone here who's looked at that list and said, I can't see any of them in my business at all? Okay. That's what I'd kind of expect. Most businesses, if not all of them, are touched by at least some of these. Negative, inadvertent, cultural impact of the way that leaders change their behavior. Now, so we all say it's happening out there. We acknowledge that. Happens in different ways, in different businesses at different times. How do we actually, how do you draw it out? How do you make it clear that it's happening? How do you do something about it? Because to do something about it, to counter those kind of cultural toxins, you need to be able to point them out and actually see that it's happening. And as we've already shown, it's not always easy to do so. So what we're talking about, just to remind you, is this bit down here. It's this underlying cultural impact that leaders have. And one of the curious things about cultural impact is that the higher up the tree you go, the more your impact as a leader tends to be indirect, and the less it is about direct. And the research is very clear on that. When you're a frontline leader, you can have a direct impact on performance and results. But the higher up you go, the more your impact becomes indirect. The more it becomes about the leadership environment that you create, the working environment that you create. How decisions are done about you, how things around you, how things get done around you, what people focus on. That's your real impact once you start getting up into very senior leadership positions. Now, we've gone out and we've had a look at that. We looked at over 100 different studies of what the academics would call mediators or moderators between how leaders behave and ultimate performance. We identified 3 key factors that have the most influence. We developed a model of these, we developed survey tools, we've surveyed over 1,000 senior leaders, we've tested them through 50 interviews, and this is what we found. The first, we found 3 factors, as I said, which have a significant, are the key factors in the working environment that leaders create that have an impact on performance. Now, the first one of these surprised me. If any of you have worked with me much, you know I don't have an awful lot of time for wishy-washy stuff, or what I perceive as wishy-washy stuff. Other people see as real, and I see as wishy-washy. And so it was with much the amusement of my colleagues when we found out that the single biggest factor in the working environment that drives performance, by a mile, is trust. By a country mile. It is the single biggest factor in the working environment that drives performance. Behaviors related to trust are consistently rated as most important by followers. They're a key driver of individual performance, team performance, organizational sales figures, net profits, and this shows you just how important it is. Trust is more important for results than how motivated employees feel, how empowered they are, or how much they enjoy their jobs. It's that important.
So how do you measure trust? What is actually...
So, when we had a look out there, there are 1,000,001 different ways to define what trust is. In fact, one recent study found 38 different kinds of descriptions of what trust is. So, in general, however, it kind of boils down to 4 things. Do people believe that they and their ideas will be treated with respect? So is there a bit of respect going on? If you come out with an idea, am I going to say, that was stupid? What's wrong with you? Or am I going to give you some respect? Do you think you're going to be treated and rewarded fairly? Do people feel they can believe what each other says? And importantly, do they find each other's behavior consistent and predictable? I used to work in prisons. And the prison officers who are the most hated are not the really mean and cruel ones. The prison officers who are most disliked are the unpredictable ones. The ones who'll be your best friend one day and are absolute terrors the other day. It's unpredictability. Because if someone's just mean and horrible, well, you can manage that in a way. At least it's predictable. You know what to do about it. But if someone's changeable, it's far harder to manage. So, the reason why trust is important is because of what it drives, and it drives 2 things. First of all, the holy grail for many businesses, which is discretionary effort. That's employees' willingness to go over and above what's in their job descriptions, to go the extra mile. The second thing is it drives employee voice, the tendency to speak up, to challenge information, to challenge thinking, to keep information flowing. And that is a critical foundation for good decision-making and risk management. Without it, decision-making and risk management kind of falls down on individual judgment. So that's why trust is important, because it drives those 2 things. But trust, factor number 1, the most important one. Factor number 2, probably the one I would have expected to be up there, which is clarity. What's important, who is accountable, why these things are important, and how should things be done? If you don't have that, stuff doesn't tend to get done. In a 2016 study, 2 of the top 3 important leadership behaviors were all about creating clarity. The third was trust. And it's because clarity drives aligned activity, better teamworking, unity, community, higher levels of employee commitment. Not trust, sorry. Clarity. But, so, trust, clarity. Third thing is what we call momentum. Now, it's a bit of a pull, it's a bit of a pulling it together, but it's really about the energy and strength for sustained activity. So the degree of motivation people feel, the degree of belief they have in that what they're doing is the right thing, the level of ownership they feel, their connection to it, and their confidence in themselves and pretty much everything else around them. So it's confidence, motivation, belief, ownership. That's what momentum is. And the reason why that's important is because people with higher levels of momentum are more likely to take the initiative, more likely to be creative and innovative. They'll show higher levels of entrepreneurialism. They'll work harder. They'll persist longer. Show loyalty. Great things. So those are 3 factors in a working environment: trust, clarity, momentum, that all drive performance on a good day. But they're also things that when things go wrong, when some of those cultural toxins start creeping in, those are the things that will get undermined. Now, there's no one particular pattern of trust, clarity, momentum which is ideal, different types of environment associated with different types of outcomes. You need to turn around a business, well, you know what, maybe clarity is particularly important. If you're trying to nurture a business more, maybe trust is more important. None of these 3 things can drop below certain levels, so they need to be high enough, but just how high they are depends upon the situation and the leader. So they're what leaders help shape. They're how they create a culture around them. And they're the mechanisms through which cultural toxins do their deeper damage. And they provide us a clue with why cultural toxins can be so hard to spot. Now, let me ask you a simple question. Simple yes or no. 1 for yes, 2 for no. Do you think leaders have an accurate sense of the working environment that they create? Oh, that was quicker and easier to answer. I love the sound of them going back down again. Let's see where we are. Okay. Now, can I say, yet again, and maybe it's because this has got something to do with the fact that you were the people who battled through the snow, but you're a particularly optimistic lot. When we've polled people before, we've come out with an average of about 2%. 2% of you think that leaders have an accurate sense of the environment they create. I have to say, you're right. The first finding we've found when we look at these 3 factors is that leaders tend not to have an accurate sense of their impact. In fact, compared to everyone else, how everyone else rates them, leaders overrate their impact on over 80% of items in a survey. On over 80% of different questions you ask leaders about their impact, leaders will say, hey, I'm wonderful. And everyone else will go, yeah, maybe you are, but not quite as wonderful as you think. So leaders overrate themselves. And that's one reason why it's hard to see cultural toxins, to see this inadvertent negative impact, because we don't always know what kind of environment we're creating. But it gets even better. Have a look at the items most overrated by leaders. I encourage people to take the initiative. I support and push people not to give up. I make other people feel we're all in this together. No, you don't. If someone puts in extra effort, I notice and appreciate it. Those are pretty, they're not things I'd like to think I overrate. Let me ask you another question. Okay, so leaders don't have much insight. How about HR? How about their bosses? How about their line managers? How about senior stakeholders? How about other people in the business? Do you think the businesses have an accurate sense of the environments that their leaders tend to create? Do you think they know who are the ones creating a good, positive culture and who are the ones that don't? That would stand out, wouldn't it? Okay. So, 53% of you say yes. So, you're still a bit optimistic. You can see that I'm beginning to knock a bit of cynicism into you, dragging you down into the dark side. But still, just about the majority of you are positive. Okay. Well, unfortunately, what the research shows, what our research shows, is that businesses tend to overrate how positive leaders' impact is. And I want to show you something really quite special indeed, because we were really shocked and surprised when we found this. This, on the left-hand side, is a traditional 360 feedback, asking about leaders' behavior. How does this leader behave? How often do they do this? How often do they do that? And what typically happens is that your direct reports say you're wonderful, and your line manager says you're not that wonderful. You're okay. But that's typically the standard way of responding that we see. When we look at a leadership impact 360, and a 360 that asks about the working environment you create. So it doesn't say how often do you behave this way. It says, what is this leader's impact on you? What is the environment they tend to create? A different type of 360. We found exactly the opposite pattern of responding. Exactly the opposite. The line manager and other senior stakeholders say, well, yeah, the individual's great. They create team, they create a nice environment. And the direct reports, the people who are on the receiving end of it, say, well, you know what, it's not that great. So you get exactly the opposite pattern of response.
Just looking at those numbers, is it really significant difference?
Over the number of people that we look at, yes. It becomes significant when you have enough numbers. When we first started it out, and we had just smaller numbers, so when we first had a check of this, and we only had like 100, 200 responses, the differences were much, much larger. what happens when you study very large pools of people, you get regression to the mean. You get, because you get some high scores and some low scores, they tend to average out in the middle somewhere. So the differences become smaller and smaller and smaller. But they are significant with the now over 1,000 responses that we've had. But just the fact that it's different is completely opposite is quite shocking. So leaders tend to overrate the impact they have. Businesses tend to overrate the impact they have. What do you think it is that that businesses and leaders tend to overrate most? Which element of the leadership environments are businesses most likely to overrate in their leaders? Do you think they overrate the amount of trust that leaders create? Do you think they overrate the amount of clarity they create? Or the amount of momentum they create? What do you think they tend to overrate the most? Okay, let's find out. Okay, that's interesting. Most of you think it's clarity, okay? All right, so you think businesses overrate the amount of clarity that leaders create. All right, actually, unfortunately, businesses are most likely to overrate leaders' ability to create trust. And you can see it here. We call it managers, but it's senior stakeholders in this group as well. You can see how much senior stakeholders tend to overrate the levels of trust compared to what direct reports would say. The people on the receiving end of that working environment. Interestingly, leaders tend to have a pretty reasonable sense of how much trust they create. But the senior stakeholders within the business vastly overrate it, far more. Now, the reason why that's important is remember what trust drives. Critically, employee voice, which is important for decision-making, for risk management, and creativity and innovation. And what is the response of many businesses to tough and uncertain times? Let's innovate our way out of this. Let's try and come up with some new ideas for revenue growth. So, what we're finding is that the impact that tough and negative times have on leaders doesn't always have a positive impact. And when it has a negative impact, it tends to be hidden. And the thing that is most hidden is the impact upon things like decision-making and risk management and innovation, things that become more important, arguably, in tough and uncertain times. That's not a great mix. So, the trust item's most overrated. It's there. The way this person behaves makes people feel able to question and challenge their thinking. The way this person behaves helps people feel able to challenge norms and convention. Those are the two items most overrated by senior stakeholders. We tend to overrate those things, and those are bad things to overrate. So, those are three of the key findings we found. Leaders tend not to have an accurate sense of their impact. Senior stakeholders tend to overrate how positive leaders' impact is, and they're most likely to overrate leaders' ability to create trust. So, businesses have a blind spot when it comes to cultural toxins and the damage they do because they have a blind spot around the environments that leaders create. If we can't see on a day-to-day basis the working environments that leaders create, then we're certainly not going to be able to see when those working environments go wrong. And that's why working environments are so important, because they show why exactly this remains hidden and under the surface. Okay. Working environments are kind of like what I would call the stomping ground of cultural toxins. It's what gets damaged by cultural toxins. And it also provides a lever to counter them. And let's have a look at some of that now. I promised you 6 ways. Let's have a look at them. We're going to look at 3 in more detail, 3 in less. The first thing you need to do to counter the negative impact that leaders can inadvertently have because they're changing their behavior in tough and uncertain times is to simply make that impact more visible. And leadership environments, as I said, provide us with a way to do that. And I want to show you three ways in which we've done that. And with all of these, by the way, all of these counters, they all tend to focus on selection and development, because those are our key interactions with so many of our leaders. Who we choose to put into what position, and then what we do to support them in that role. Now, the first thing that I've put up there is leadership dashboards. So what we've done in some of the clients that we've worked with is to combine a leadership environment model with a traditional capability model to help focus leaders on the cultural impact that they're having. So traditional capability models just focus on the way that leaders behave. They say, we want you to do this. We want you to be strategic. We want you to be driving of results, destroying of competition. Well, maybe not that, but that's kind of implied, isn't it? Rather than overtly said. So what we've done is we've added in leadership environments into a traditional capability model. So as well as leadership behaviors, as well as the results you want leaders to drive, you also put in the culture that they're actually creating. And you actually make that explicit as something that you look for and you measure and you encourage within the leaders in your business. That's one way of actually making leadership environments and therefore the cultural impact that leaders are having more visible. Put it into your leadership capability frameworks, not just behaviors. The second way, and it kind of builds off that, is to actually change how leadership selection is done. And we work with a large regional retail business to help them focus on the impact that leaders had, as well as the leadership skills and behaviors. Because typically when we employ someone, we will interview them against certain criteria. We'll do the chemistry test with the line manager or some stakeholders to see whether they're liked, to see whether they're going to fit in, and that's it. We may implicitly think about the cultural impact they're going to have, about the working environment, but we don't necessarily always explicitly look at it. So one way you can make it more explicit is to simply ask people to focus on it in selection processes. So we work with this regional retail business, which previously had been focused almost entirely on benchmarking, just finding the best candidate possible. And what we did is that with internal candidates, we used a leadership environment 360, and with external candidates, we created a leadership environment interview guide, questions that interviewers could ask to try and dig into some of these environments that leaders create. And what we found after doing that was the failure rates of new hires decreased, which reduced cost and risk, which is great. We got less cultural rejection of less people failing. We also found something really interesting: diversity of new hires increased. And one of the reasons we think for that is that people were no longer focused on just trying to find the best ideal leader, and were thinking more about what is the impact that this leader is going to have. It wasn't an impact we were trying to have, it's just something that came out. So, you can also make the cultural impact that leaders have more visible in leadership selection processes. And finally, you've got leadership development. Typically, historically, development programs focus on how leaders behave, trying to teach you to be better at this, to be better at that. How about we had development programs that focus on the impact that you have? Yes, you still have to look at how leaders behave, but your starting point is the impact that they have. So we work with a large regional construction business. They were trying to create a more innovative culture. We diagnosed the culture based on the leadership environment model. And we then created a development program for them that was based entirely around how to improve levels of trust, in particular, and employee voice within the business, because it was found to be very, very low. And we found greater cultural change, more performance increases than over other programs. So development programs focused on the impact that leaders are having rather than just the way that they are behaving. And it's a subtle difference, but it's also really big. So, first thing you can do to counter cultural toxins, to make sure that we don't get this inadvertent cultural scarring from the way that leaders change under pressure, is to make leadership environments more visible. The second thing we can do is increase clarity. And this is a really intriguing thing. And I do a lot of work out in the Middle East, and they're doing tons of work in this. It's really quite fascinating. So we know that ambiguity breeds gossip and politicking. And one way to counter that is by providing certainty, providing clarity, what the challenges are, what the response will be, what is important, what needs to happen next, who is accountable for what. And so what we're seeing is an upsurge in firms providing communication support to leaders. In other words, how do you create clarity? And I'm certainly working with some firms that have significantly increased the number of comms specialists they've got and put them to work directly, partnering them with senior leaders far more focused on internal comms, just to try and decrease some of this uncertainty. But it's actually a focus on clarity and comms in a way that to a level that I really haven't seen before. The third thing we're finding is, and this is probably the most growing area of all of the 6 that I'm going to tell you about, is to focus on a focus on strengthening employee voice. And this is happening in particular because many firms' response to the current economic trading conditions is to try and innovate their way out of it. Yes, we need to cut costs. Yes, we need to be careful on costs. But you know what? We also need to innovate the heck out of this. And possibly the most insidious cultural toxin you can find is this reduction in employee voice that can happen. A stopping of people speaking up and speaking out. And the reason why it's insidious, it can be hard to notice. But it stifles information flow, robs leaders of insight and opinions. So we're seeing firms directly, systematically invest in their leaders in trying to encourage and grow employee voice. Big development programs on getting people to speak up on decision making in a way that maybe 15, 20 years ago was commonplace and then died out. But it's now coming back with a vengeance. But that focuses on how do you drive employee voice, how do you drive good decision-making, almost information flow it's being rebranded as. And I'm even seeing a couple of businesses begin to come out, and I suspect this is going to be a growing tendency. In their capability models, we're seeing information flow as a core capability for our leaders, managing information flow. Wouldn't surprise me if we see it called managing data at some point, but yeah. Sounds a bit more electronic highway, doesn't it? Okay, so we've got make leadership environments more visible, increase clarity, strengthen voice and insight, focus on collaboration. So I'm going to tell you about 3 now, which we're seeing happening, but in less. It's happening, they're just happening less. The fourth one then is focus on collaboration. We are seeing some firms, and actually we're seeing it across the leadership industry. You only have to look at in HBR or MIT Sloan Management Review. You're seeing far more articles on team working, far more articles on collaboration. And we're seeing businesses respond to this by investing in it. So they're actually saying, yes, we know that some of the uncertainty is driving people to focus on their own silos, to focus on their own areas. So we are proactively, systematically trying to do something about that. And so we're seeing a far greater focus on collaboration. And sometimes it's done in the name of efficient functioning and efficiency, but it's all there around collaboration. The next thing is driving delegation. Again, we're seeing firms in a way that we haven't really seen focused on for many years now, focused on doing training courses, development courses for some of their senior leaders, brief ones, brief half-dayers on driving delegation, making sure that they're delegating sufficiently. Now this for me is really quite staggering. If you think about where we've come from, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we're talking about the need for visionary, transformational leaders. And now we're seeing an upsurge in brief development programs and almost management 101. How do you delegate? You know, it's really a move almost back towards leadership as just good management. So this is it's a real shift out there that we're seeing, and it's quite noticeable that firms are actually doing something specific and systematic around that. And the last thing, which is growing, it's out there. You hear this word more and more, resilience. And we're seeing a vast increase in the number of firms who are providing kind of support for their most senior leaders. Many firms that we've been dealing out there are actually finding it tougher to find people to step up into the most senior roles. Sometimes for financial reasons, and other times because leaders are turning around and saying, you know what, I've got so far, I've got to a sufficiently senior level, I'm well paid, I've got a nice share package, I'm not sure I really want that next step up. Do I really need it? I do have a family. Be nice to see them sometimes. And so we're seeing that actually the pool of people who are willing to step up into that most senior level, those most senior roles, is actually reducing. And a lot of that is to do with, do I really want the hassle, the regulation, all of those extra pressures there are to deal with? And so firms are acting to deal with that. Because when you get a leader who's struggling with that, you get this cascading effect. When a leader struggles with stress, you can guarantee their direct reports will struggle with stress. And if their direct report, it just trickles down through the business. So look, those are 6 things that we're seeing. A focus on making leaders' impact more visible, cultural impact more visible. A focus on comms and clarity. A focus on strengthening employee voice. A focus on collaboration. These brief development programs and driving delegation and Management 101, and stuff around resilience and fostering that, coaching support for leaders. Those are some of the responses that we're seeing. And each of them marks, I think, a significant change from where we've been in the world of development in the last 5 or 10 years. And I think there's 2 real significant things that are happening. Firstly, we're seeing the shift from looking at how leaders behave to the impact they have. And I think that's just growing. The second thing that we're also seeing is this shift away from this visionary transformational leader to some of these more basics, core, essentials, whatever words you want to use for them. Quick question for you. Have any of you tried any of these cultural toxin remedies? Again, you can vote for more than one if you want. Okay, let's go with 27. Okay, so interestingly, focus on collaboration comes out top. Some of this stuff on teams, team working. If any of you are interested, my colleague Rob Morris was over here from the States talking about change-ready teams a couple of months ago. If any of you haven't seen that, we will send out, there is a copy of the talk he did available, and there's a paper that goes along with it. We can send it out with it. But there's some really interesting stuff going on around collaboration and teams. Fostering resilience, up there is the second most common response to that. I'm kind of, I knew it was a growing area, but I'm kind of surprised on that. Comms is recognized by you in strengthening voice insight. What isn't kind of noticed is, this is really fascinating, considering that the number one thing, if memory serves me correctly, of those cultural toxins, the most noticed cultural toxin was the lack of delegation and everyone stepping down a level. The response which is least recognized by you, or least engaged by any of your firms, is the response that directly deals with the thing that you say you recognize most as a cultural toxin. This stepping down, this lack of delegation, which is really quite something odd going on there. Any thoughts on that, actually? Why do you think that is? Why do you think it is that when I ask you which of the cultural toxins are most recognizable, the thing you voted for top was this leaders are stepping down, they're getting dragged into the detail, they're not delegating enough. And yet, when we have a look at the responses that businesses are engaging in, actually the one that directly addresses that is the one that's least recognized by you. How come this discrepancy?
I think it's just in what you described, that it's seen as a management tool. It's not labelled. It's seen as a good management practice. We would label this as something like empowering others.
Okay.
Or almost like an engagement practice.
So,
rather than a leadership development.
Got you. So does that mean you're doing it just under a different name? Or that there's this discrepancy of...
It prompted me to think we need to look at it. We need to look at good management skills. We're too in the ether of what are great transformational leaders. And actually maybe we need to come back a step to the basics.
What's really... Go on, please.
I think there might be an issue of root cause of it as well, because, the effect that we're seeing is this people dropping down.
Yeah.
If the cause of that is people forgetting how to delegate, then delegation training would be an answer. But I don't think that's the cause. I think the cause is rooted in some of the other things, like the stress people are facing.
Got you.
So the initiatives to foster resilience, I think...
That's why they're proving more...
I don't think delegation training, at least with my top leaders, would make a great deal of difference, which is why I'm not particularly looking at it.
Okay, but it's so actually you're probably covering that, but you're covering it under resilience instead. And actually, because it's a different root cause that you see.
I think so, if I'm right on the root cause. But. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That sounds entirely plausible. I have to say that for what you said as well, though, I'm working with a business, again, it's out in the Middle East, but they have a problem with core management skills. And one of the problems is that for the last 5 years, they've been sending all their leaders off on these big Harvard IMD programs, because they're out in the Middle East, and that's what you do. And by the way, some of these leaders get sent away on 3-month-long development programs at Harvard. £100,000. And you just, I don't know, if my business turned around to me and said, Nick, we want you to go off on this development program for 3 months, I think I'd turn around and say, do you really need me then? If it doesn't all fall apart when I'm away, that's a bit of a risk to me, isn't it? Maybe that's just my paranoid nature coming out there. But what's really interesting is that we're having to think about, in the design of this development program, how on earth do we piece it together and package it so it's actually acceptable to these people who've been used to going out on these big Harvard strategic, be a transformational leader type courses, and now we're turning around to them and saying, well, actually, we actually need you to meet with your direct reports, have one-to-ones with them, and other minor points. And actually, how do you do something around that in a way which is acceptable to the audience? So both of those are kind of interesting responses. Oh,
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
From the research you've done, how sophisticated is the thinking around recognising that organisations need different types of leaders? So I think for us, we obviously kind of our organisation went down a big transformational leader route, and you realise actually everybody doesn't need to be a big transformational leader. You perhaps need just a couple of big transformational leaders, and then there's a degree of the support around really great people managers who support the leaders. Where is the thinking on the balance of the types of leaders that an organisation needs?
Well, the balance isn't there. And partially that's because the leadership industry for the last 10, 20, 30 years, 40, 50 years, has been focused on how leaders behave. And we've been focused on how leaders behave because it's an easy thing to measure. You can measure how leaders behave, you can measure how the business performs, and then you can say, hey, bingo, look, this is the way you need your leaders to behave. And you come up with all these models like transformational leadership, like charismatic leadership, benevolent leadership, servant leadership. But I saw a great study just this morning come out, turned up in my inbox, having a look at benevolent leadership. And what it shows is what they call a curvilinear relationship between benevolent leadership and performance. Curvilinear is like an upside down U. So if you're not benevolent at all, your team probably won't perform well. If you're, Goldilocks amount of benevolent, your team will perform well. And if you're too benevolent, the team isn't going to perform well. The amazing thing is it's not just you need different types of leaders, you need different types of leadership. And you need different types of leadership styles. And because I think we've been focused more upon the behaviors that leaders exhibit rather than the impact that they have, that hasn't really been drawn attention to. Now, the market is changing a bit, and we are seeing a far greater focus on leadership impact, leadership environment, and if you come anywhere within 100 miles of me over the last 6 months, you'll have heard me say the word leadership environment or leadership impact a lot. But it's not just me, the whole market, I think, is beginning to shift that way. So I think the balance is going to happen, but it's difficult And the reason it's difficult is that what businesses and what leaders want is a really clear message. One of the great things about transformational leadership is that it turned around and it said, it made a promise to you, a really simple sales pitch. And it said, you do these 4 things and you'll transform your business. You'll become a transformational leader. You'll have a wonderful impact. And it's a nice, easy sales routine. The problem with saying, well, you need to do different things in different situations, that's not as clear. Joanna?
Well, I wonder as well, though, whether it seems to me that there's been a real measurement of impact in terms of measurement of bottom line over the last, as things get more difficult to focus on the bottom line, because that's what tells their shareholders of their market that they're doing well. And actually, when some companies, because I've been working, have found that they get the results they need, things like delegation don't get in there because they're getting the result. They're quite happy that they've done something.
Yep.
And actually, so they are measuring impact. It's just they're measuring the kind of impact. I do think that there has been measurement of impact. A lot of it. It's just not been.
Yeah, so it tends to be short-term results. And the problem is how do you create sustainability? How do you balance that with sustainability? And that's why I think having models and ways to measure the impact that leaders have, having a language to talk about it is important.
I think that if we tell people that they should measure impact, I think that puts us into that sets people, sets their hairs on each other because they get people's backs up because they will say that they've been measuring it. So I think in a way we also have to find our language to do this.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's why working environments tends to respond to people, but we're
There's another aspect of this that we're only recently starting to see technology come up that makes the measuring leadership environments and culture a lot easier. So if you're thinking about different types of fit of leadership style to environment down to department, to do that you need to have a tool that kind of measures the background so you can fit the leader within it. And that's only really within the last kind of 5 years, as far as I'm aware, that there's real sophistication in that.
I think it's growing. I think what's probably, but I might push back on that because I think we've had the basic technology to do some of this. I don't necessarily think you need great technology to have a look at cultural impact and look at the culture within a business. But new technology is helping and it is making it easier. We're also seeing the impact of meta-analyses. Now, if you think about it, that meta-analyses is a statistical technique that allows you to combine the results of multiple different studies. And so to come up with an overall, overarching understanding that looks at tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And I think that's probably had a bigger impact. I mean, yes, that's been around with us for about 30, 40 years now, meta-analyses, but its impact is growing or just along that we go on because we get more studies to pull from. Look, I think not all cultural toxins are you going to find all of them in your business. I haven't certainly described all the responses that can be made. But I think the key thing that I wanted the key point to get across that is that organizations need to become more alert to the spread of these toxins, more alert to the impact that their leaders are having on a cultural level and not just in terms of short-term results. More aware of their vulnerability to them and more proactive in addressing them. And I think the reason why the time is ripe for this is because we are living in such uncertain times. Is because all the feedback we're getting from our businesses is that they're saying, well, you know what, it's almost becoming the new normal. That increase in pressure over maybe what it was 10 years ago, well, before the 2008 crisis. Yes, firms have to focus on the commercial challenges that tough and uncertain times to create, but to meet them and to avoid cultural scarring from them, they also need to counter these cultural toxins, these inadvertent side effects. And the key lever points that we have to deal with it are selection and development decisions. Who we hire, who we promote, what we decide to focus on in development processes for our leaders. Those are the key lever points that we have to actually act to counter them. Any questions? Any thoughts? Regrets? concerns?
Nick, maybe you said a little bit about a particular groups that might be impacted by the cultural toxins in your research. So who are the kind of canaries in the mine that would give us a bit of a signal that things aren't going as well as we might hope?
Look, it's different in different situations, different in different businesses. Some businesses will tell you you need to look at your frontline staff. So I was working with a retail bank, and it was it was what was happening in their branches that made a difference. You could see it. In other businesses, I see it particularly at CEO -2 or 3. That's where you see kind of the impact. And further down in the organization, it tends to be that actually people are a bit more protected and shielded from some of the stuff that's going on at the most senior levels. It's different in different businesses. The canaries in the mine can be anywhere. But I love that phrase, thank you. Stealing it. Any other thoughts? Let me ask you a question then. Am I going a bit John Lennon here? Am I being a bit, it's not typical for me to be optimistic. It's not typical for me to say, there's a bright spot here, there's an opportunity here. That's not really my style. Dark, miserable, that's more my style. But part of me feels that we are seeing a shift, that we are seeing a turn, that businesses are focusing more upon the longer term, sustainable, cultural impact, just because they're seeing too many fingers burnt. Am I being too optimistic to think that we are seeing a shift in what's happening, in how leaders are selected and developed and thought about?
So I would agree. I think so. I work for a bank, and I think certainly in the banking industry we're coming out of that period where leaders went through a particularly difficult time. The industry lost trust in us, everybody lost trust in us. And as a result of that, we've had to look quite hard at what we stand for and also where we want to be further down the line and almost do that forecasting to say, is the leader of the current state the leader of the future or not? So I actually would agree. I am seeing for the first time in quite a long time a shift just in the language that the business are sharing.
Okay.
They talk about hiring people and they talk about sort of forecasting what we think we might need and where we need to be.
Okay. Anyone else?
I kind of feel it depends on the depth of the crisis that business is in at the time. So I've seen businesses really stagnate in the way that you talked about right at the beginning, and they're still stuck. They're not able to look this far. They're still stuck in short-termism. And I've also seen large-scale businesses where those leaders right at the top that were part of the problem in the beginning are still there waiting for their pension funds. So you can't make these changes. You can talk about them, but can you really make these changes?
Okay. Anyone think I'm being over-optimistic? Joanna, this is a complete turnaround of our normal positions. You're normally the positive, I'm the pessimist. Anyone else? I think often the decision goes that we know, we can absolutely guarantee, or we believe this person is going to deliver those short-term commercial results we need. We hear, there may be some feeling that there might be some negative, but that's just a feeling. Whereas we feel far more certain they're going to deliver what we want. We believe in them.
You touched on selection and development. I think, as I was just reflecting on the performance management element of this as well, in terms of lots of things we do in my organisation, linked to the capability points you touched on. So judgment, for example, a quite helpful reframe. Rather than do I exercise good judgment, am I providing clarity? There will be some overlap, but there's actually quite a helpful kind of performance measurement there in how you're making clear to your teams and your leadership what you're aiming for. So for me, there was just something about performance management in my organisation, whether we've gone too much down the capability route rather than the leadership impact route. So the two joining together I found quite helpful through that.
I mean, for me personally, I think the changes in that kind of capability arena are one of the critical ones that we need if we're going to make a shift here. Because we do tend to focus on how leaders behave rather than the cultural impact that they have on the people and processes around them. And we kind of assume that the behavior automatically leads to what we want it to do, to the results, and it doesn't, because there's all this stuff in between.
I think behaviours do have an impact, though. So it's not about just getting rid of it, it's about...
No, it's about both.
Recognising that within the context that it's working. So it's not about just ditching it, it's about doing it with other things.
It's about both, and that's why in the leadership dashboard, I put up there briefly, you had both behaviours and this cultural impact piece, the leadership environment piece. Because, you know, there are some things, such as strategic thinking, for example, behaviours that just aren't covered by the working environment that a leader creates. All right, look, you've been very patient. You came here. Thank you. Good luck getting to wherever it is that you're going. If you're wearing the same shoes as I am, be careful, because it is an ice rink out there. For those of you who are slightly more sensible and bought boots, well, you can have a very safe trip back. Good luck. Thank you very much for coming. On your way out, there are copies of papers that go along with this. There's a copy of a couple of books out there. Feel free to pick them up. There's freebies. There's cakes. I'm sure there's some stuff left. And I believe, and I might be corrected here, that if any of you want to go around the London Transport Museum, that's a freebie with it too. Is that right, Laura? Okay, so if any of you want to do a tour of the London Transport Museum, go see Laura. She'll actually sort you out with something now. Thank you very much indeed.